Hello, thank you for joining me. Today we have a special edition, our first Australian gender critical monsters since Sal Grover, who we had on last year. I'm speaking today to Katherine Deves and Holly Lawford-Smith. Hi guys, how are you doing?
Hi. Hello.
Very pleased to have you. Can you tell me a little bit about yourselves? Katherine, how did you get involved in all this?
I'm a recent law graduate. I'm awaiting admission to the New South Wales Supreme Court as a solicitor. So I started looking into this a few years ago, both as a lawyer and a new mother of baby twin girls. Thought I needed to freshen up on my feminism and came across this new concept of gender identity and went looking and obviously quickly realised that something was very wrong and women's rights were under threat. I went looking at the legislation in Australia and to my surprise found that gender identity had already been incorporated into our federal legislation and our state legislation, and things had already progressed further than I could have imagined in my worst nightmare. And then
when was this, did you say, Katherine?
That went in 2013, so I was looking probably around 2016. And then I went looking online for like-minded women, came across the UK debate first, like Holly, and then to my great joy and delight found that there were actually networks of women in Australia who thought the same way as me. So then I started speaking out last year when I co-founded a group called Save Women's Sports Australasia with some New Zealand women, just in relation to the impact of transgender inclusion policies in Australia that were being put out there that are obviously impacting women's sports with the inclusion of biological males. Yeah.
Okay, great. Holly, how about yourself?
I'm a philosopher and I got involved in the debate through the UK situation following Kathleen Stock's essay, which kind of exploded inside philosophy about self-ID in the UK, and just being really furious watching how the philosophy community responded to her.
Yes.
So I think I got hooked up pretty quickly with the, I don't know what they were at the time, maybe 6 or 8 philosophy people in the UK that were sort of supporting Kathleen. So we built a little gang of women and yeah, I talked a lot. I came over for some conferences and events. I think I was at Lesbians on Chairs for one of the early Posey events, you know, like getting enculturated and radicalized.
Yes.
So yeah,
yes.
all prepared for when it arrived in Victoria.
I'm a little bit confused about the timeline because, Katherine, you were saying that you started looking into this in 2013 and you said it was already embedded.
So I started looking probably in about 2016. And I found, so in 2013, amendments were made to our Sex Discrimination Act. So Sex Discrimination Act of 1984, that was for the purpose of incorporating the UN Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, also known as CEDAW. We were signatories to that. So that was enacted in 1984. And then in 2013, at the end of the Gillard administration, they sneaked in gender identity into Sex Discrimination Act. So they made it a protected characteristic. And the definition was on the basis of the one that came out of the Yogyakarta principles. So basically, it's a circular definition that's based on subjectivity and stereotypes.
But it's maybe important to, it's just maybe important to say there wasn't so much of a people paying attention to that. Like at the time, there were some people, but certainly wasn't our group. So it wasn't until it started kind of kicking off with self-ID, probably from, I'd say the most recent round of stuff kind of came to attention because of what happened in the UK, right? And then New Zealand followed suit, tried to follow suit, and then various states of Australia tried to follow suit. And so we all kind of got a bit organized around that time, but we weren't really paying attention back then.
So, right, yes. And it does seem to be the case we found over here that gender identity into law seems to be something that is being sneaked in various different ways. It seems to all operate under stealth. Over here, Stonewall has been the one that has been misrepresenting the Equality Act to institutions all over the UK. Is there an equivalent organization in Australia?
There's a few. So there's Equality Australia down in Victoria. So their main focus used to be same-sex marriage, and obviously we achieved that. So they're looking for a new focus. Here in the state of New South Wales, it would mostly be ACON, which is the AIDS Council of New South Wales. So that started out as a charity focusing on HIV awareness and prevention for gay males. Thankfully, the AIDS crisis is under control, so they've expanded into transgender ideology, and in particular the sports programming that's coming from them.
Right, yes. Right. You were saying that you anticipated it a little bit, but it sounds to me that the most recent thing I've heard, which is so frightening, is a huge win for them, which is the conversion therapy law. Let's start with the bad news. Can you tell us, what is this conversion therapy law? What does it mean for children and women over there?
I mean, the bad news is that it just passed in Victoria. So Kat's in New South Wales and I'm in Victoria, but we think it's coming there soon as well. So that's gone through. It's, I think, the most draconian form of that legislation. So it has been introduced in other states of Australia already, but kind of limited to medical practitioners, or just kind of a more restricted version. This version was, in principle, bringing in everyone. I'm sure Kath can refine my what I say. But I think the intention was adults in some sort of position of authority, but that's really wide. I mean, teachers,
parents,
basically anyone. And then they had an exemption in for some clinicians. So if it was like in line with the kind of values of the association, or I can't remember how they worded it, but it was like if it was in the sort of professional guidelines that they would need to be able to give advice that wasn't affirmation only or following their conscience, they could. So it was like basically everyone has to support or affirm gender identities from now on, except maybe a few clinicians if it's a matter of their conscience.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So that seems very hard to police and very very loose and odd as a bit of law. Yeah. And how many years in prison is it? Is it 10 years or something like that?
It's 10 years. 10 years and $200,000. Also, if you're an organisation who engages in these practices, I think it's a fine of up to nearly $1 million. And looking at other jurisdictions within Australia and around the world, it's only like maybe 12 months, 2 years at maximum.
Okay, so I just want to make sure we remind people what this means. This means that if you have let's say, effeminate gay teenager who thinks they're not gay, but actually the opposite sex, then you will get 10 years in prison if you try and stop that child from taking drugs and cutting off body parts. That's what that means, right?
Like it could, as an extreme example, there would have to be a few steps in between. You would have had to have caused harm to the child, serious harm, and that could be depression. That could also be a psychiatric injury, and that would have to go through the criminal courts. So you would have the normal due process there. However, there's a civil mechanism and a criminal mechanism. But with the civil mechanism, they have granted really extraordinary powers to this tribunal down there called the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, like really extraordinary powers. And any person has the right to make a complaint about any other person that they believe has engaged in suppressive or conversion practices. And that person can make a complaint and then just walk away. And then the tribunal has the right to, they have very extraordinary investigative powers. They can compel you to attend. They can compel you to produce documents. It is allegedly a voluntary process, but they can go ahead and do the investigation, make a decision, enforce a punishment. And if you don't go along with that, they can start kicking it up the chain. And that's when you can be captured by the criminal system. It's it's like the Star Chamber, effectively. So there are huge concerns with it.
Yeah. It sounds as well like it's giving anonymous social media users a loaded gun to use against people they don't like.
Because they've said it can be online conduct. And the way that they have defined like the key parts of the legislation, like a suppression practice is defined as a practice that is suppressive. So let's try
like a woman is someone who feels like a woman.
Yeah. And then for sexual orientation, they've completely thrown that out the window. It is not same-sex orientation. They've put in an emotional connection to, affiliation with a person of the same gender, a different gender, or any other gender. So what does that mean? Yeah. And then obviously gender identity, again, is just, I think, at its most ridiculous interpretation, it was like a person's personal sense of their personal preferences.
Wow.
That could be the legal interpretation. So how
really...
on earth is our judiciary supposed to interpret something that's so nebulous and vague with such extreme punishments?
Yes.
You know? Yeah.
That's an interesting aspect of it, isn't it? Because that means that it basically turns ordinary people into potential kind of Stasi members who are able to inform on each other. It creates a very kind of unstable environment, doesn't it, for people in general? It's kind of deranging. Holly, from a philosophical point of view, it must be even more frightening for you to look at.
Well, I was just going to say it's kind of interesting because the actual wording of the bill suggested that everything is a change or suppression practice unless, and then there was this kind of narrow definition. And so that was kind of philosophically interesting because they were counting omissions, failures to affirm or support, even if you remained neutral. So just looking at the wording, it really seemed like that they're not even saying like it was like you have to support or affirm. You can't even just be like, oh, you're a woman, are you? Right? But then it was really interesting because in the debate, so a lot of us, Kath and I and a number of others, we sort of tuned into the live stream for a lot of the debate as it was going through. And then the Attorney General was kind of insisting that wasn't the case. So she was sort of saying, no, in the bill where it says what is not a change or suppression practice, it's just like trying to give clinicians the space to affirm people's gender identities without that counting as conversion. So it was like somehow how they understood what it meant wasn't really tied to what the words said. And that was even more baffling. So I almost feel like I've just got no idea what the bill
does. Yeah.
I mean,
that's it. And surely that's the most frightening kind of law, is law that can be applied in a subjective way.
Yeah. And when they were debating it, the people who were questioning were saying, well, what about with this scenario? Or can we have clarity around that? And the Attorney General basically said at one point, well, we're all really tired and the Legislative Assembly has already gone home. So we're just basically going to tell you that some people know what it means, but we're not going to tell you, and we all want to go home.
That's great.
Yeah.
It was bizarre.
Well, okay. I don't want to be offensive, but that sounds particularly Australian in some ways. It's so hot, you must want to sleep all the time. But like the other thing that I find strange about Australia, same thing I always thought about Scotland. I thought Australians and Scottish people would never stand for this because they always seem to me like a what would you call them? A group, a people. They always seem to be a people who didn't take bullshit easily.
Yeah, no nonsense. Yeah, agreed.
So again, I guess this is the reason that it's gotten so far in Australia is due to the stealth tactics.
Yeah. And in the debates, there were huge numbers of objections, thousands. We had the AMA, the peak medical body, raising concerns. We had the Law Institute of Victoria raising like these very credible, powerful organisations. And basically the Attorney General said, oh, well, we consulted with these people. We decided not to listen to them. And that was the end of it.
Yeah, she kept saying consultation doesn't mean agreeing. We can consult and then we can disagree. Yeah, true, fair point. But you didn't really consult, did you? Because you have to sort of at least take the reasons on board and like respond appropriately, not just be like, yeah, they said things at us, we blocked our ears, and then we carried on with what we wanted to do anyway.
Yeah. So
like the Greens representative said, all these people contacted me, but they're basically all just bigots and I didn't listen to them.
Yeah.
Wow. And so what is the situation there in terms of people waking up to this? Do you see it happening? It seems to be happening over here to some degree. Are people kind of waking up and going, what? What are you saying? I think that's what most ordinary people think is, what are you? Who's a woman?
I feel like in Victoria, I think my opinion is that in Australia, we're well behind the UK on the waking up part. Mm-hmm. And I think in Victoria, there just haven't been enough public scandals such that the conversation is really going. So the recent thing that happened with the baths in Sydney was like newsworthy, but you need to have challenges to women's spaces or something happening in prison, or sports kind of makes the news quite regularly because Australia is a very sports-focused country. So that's almost the only cases where you regularly get coverage of and then the coverage is often positive. It's like, oh, poor 6'2" Hannah Mounsey isn't allowed to play in the sport that he wants to play
isn't allowed to shower. Isn't allowed to shower with the women. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So but I think because there haven't been as many of these things in the news for the public discussion, the public discussion hasn't sort of turned and divided in the way that it had in the UK. So that's still yet to happen, I think.
Someone over here pointed out that the dreadful thing about all this is that we all can see the tragedies that are up ahead.
Yeah.
But it's actually going to take some of those tragedies happening to women before anyone acts on them.
Yeah. And also, like the Tavistock decision, that was discussed in Victoria on the floor in relation to the medicalisation of children. We get a constant barrage of news articles about young children that have been transitioned. Their families are all delighted. Everyone's excited. We get nothing on detrans or desisters. When they were debating and people brought up the Tavistock, they said, well, that's England and we're not going to listen to them. And it's like, our entire legal system is based on English law. We're constantly discussing Gillick, so why are you ignoring it? Like the politician said, oh, well, that's not relevant to this legislation here. And I think we'd all disagree with that because the Victorian legislation has now entrenched a medicalised affirmation pathway for children. So in the press, there's only one side being heard. It's been extraordinarily difficult to get any coverage of any critical voices.
Yeah, it was really disingenuous in the debate, right? Because the Attorney General, she said something that was strictly true, which was that the conversion therapy bill is a separate matter from when you give puberty blockers to children, right? And that's strictly speaking true. You could ban the conversion of gender identities and have a very sensible over 18s policy on puberty blockers.
That's very true.
She was just trying to say they're separate matters. But the problem is, given that we do hand out puberty blockers to children in Victoria, legislating then that you have to support or affirm gender identities on pain of criminal punishment is going to mean many more medicalised children. And so the fact that she wouldn't see that connection or admit what it's likely to lead to in Victoria, I think that was really disingenuous.
Yeah. So what exactly is the state of the resistance to all this stuff in Australia, Katherine?
So when I first started looking into this and I found some very hidden like networks of women, it was quite difficult. The numbers have really grown, and there are some more generic groups. I think as within the UK and the US, there's also groups coming out of the, I don't like using the left-right dichotomy, but the more conservative right side of things. The faith leaders were very against the conversion bill, so they were very vocal. And whenever they're interviewed in the press, they never mention the feminists. They never mention the lesbians. They never mention the mums who've been pushing against this for years. But I think we're all starting to find each other now and connect and try and figure out how we can work together. So it's definitely growing. Yeah.
Yes. One thing that I always find really odd about this is how, let's say, the Democrats in the US and the Labour Party and all the left-wing parties here don't realize that this is a huge open goal for the right. That as soon as the midterms come around for the Democrats, as soon as there's another election 4 years' time in America, whenever it is over here, all they have to say is, well, they want to take your, let's say, scholarships and sports prizes away from your daughters. And they would be right. All they have to do is tell the truth, and the left will end up looking like idiots, you know? I mean, sorry, Holly, what do you think of that kind of disconnect that the left has over this issue? That they don't realize what a disaster it is?
I don't know, because I don't know whether that backlash is going to happen or not, because people are so enthralled to this idea of being progressive and like, I don't know. I felt like that when this stuff happened with the conversion bill in Victoria, some of the liberal, like right-ish politicians were saying that the whole bill was wedge politics. So the whole bill was literally just put in place so that the conservative politicians would oppose it. One of them said it was full of traps. Like it was like it had been written to troll them so that they would speak out, so that the left party could then be like, oh, the liberals hate the gays and oppose conversion therapy ban, so that they could then get re-elected in the next election. So there was this hypothesis that the whole thing was just bullshit politics, messing around with children's lives, right? Like we're going to have more detransitioners now because of this stupid thing. But that almost looks like the left is in control, right? They're trolling and they're doing these clever traps, and then the right are unable to even oppose the stupid bill because that means they're not going to get in at the next election. So I don't know how much faith to put in any of that. Like maybe that's not right, but it doesn't give me much faith that like the more conservative parties would be in the position to sort of embarrass the left and sweep in. It doesn't look like they're in charge. So I don't know.
Yeah, I just think that I think one of the things that's happening is it's so confusing that even the right don't know how to fight it, because it's on such weird wobbly ground and terms aren't clarified. But I do think that when the victims of it start coming in, it's going to be a huge gift to the right. Would you say that's true, Holly?
Yeah, I mean, I wish you could have seen how much apologizing there had to be in the parliamentary debate just for the more right-leaning politicians to even start making their point. Like they sometimes get 30 minutes, depending what party they are, they get more or less time. And they would literally have to start off by saying, some of my best friends are gay. I was a celebrant at my gay friend's wedding recently. I love the gays. But there are some problems in this bill. So it's like, even that is like they've been painted into a corner so much on what they're allowed to say and whether they're called a bigot, that they spend half their time defending against the charge rather than just coming out with all the problems in the legislation. And that was happening with the self-ID discussion as well. So again, I don't know how to feel about any of this, really. Just confused more than anything.
Well, maybe they're confused because gender ideology puts white men at the top of the pyramid, so they don't really feel comfortable opposing it because that's what they want. So what's coming up, and what should we be paying attention to over here, and what should we be helping you guys on? Is there stuff that we should be focusing on? Katherine.
So, with the conversion legislation, they are looking to push some through in Tasmania. And they had an inquiry as to the legislation, and the verbiage was all exactly the same as what was happening in Victoria. So they will be asking for submissions. So to watch Tasmania, that would be great. Also, New South Wales, it's going to be inevitable. Here, in my state, there is a politician who has put forward some legislation to ban the teaching of gender identity ideology in schools. And that inquiry is currently open. We can provide the link somehow, but you can go on and do a survey.
I'll put it in that here.
10-minute survey, or you can do a more robust submission if you want to. So they would be our biggest issues at the moment. And look, I've heard that Australia is a bit of the canary in the coal mine for some of these other countries. And obviously they're pushing through such extreme legislation here. So, I think people just, if they can maybe support our groups, watch what's happening, and hopefully maybe learn from what we're going through down here and head it off at the pass in their own countries.
Yeah. Well, so where would you say, I mean, on a scale, Canada is completely captured, including in the courts, which we just wrote about today. And Ireland is pretty captured. Where would you say Australia is along that line? Is it hopeless the way it is in Canada at the moment? I mean, sorry, it's not hopeless in Canada, but it feels hopeless.
Well, look, I think maybe in Australia, when I think the sports, between my 3 children, they do 8 sports in a calendar year, and that's not abnormal. So I think when people start to see their daughters being impacted, there might start to be an outcry. But generally, the problem with Australians is we're pretty apathetic because we have it pretty good down here. You know, the weather's good, there's COVID going on, but we're an island, so we've managed to keep it relatively under control. So, you know, it's not like the UK where you have this history of pushing against, you know, like with the Thatcher years, you all know how to organise politically. Down here, we just haven't had a similar history. So people sort of go, oh, she'll be right, except it's not anymore. But yeah,
it's funny you say that, because over here the excuse used is that everybody's thinking about COVID and there's too much other stuff going on, and that's why. But I think one of the big problems at the moment is because of COVID, we are not seeing sports. We're not seeing the results, and sports is the clearest visual reminder of what actually is happening. You know, I mean, sorry, Holly, go ahead.
Oh, just maybe another thing to say about Australia is that it kind of really goes state by state, so more like it does in the US. So Victoria is Canada, like we've got a woke, super woke idiot state, and then we've got like way more backward, kind of dragging their feet, will be the last one to ever introduce it type state. Yes. And there's just really such a spectrum there, and it sort of tracks very different kind of character of populations. And so maybe there's an Ireland and maybe there's a UK.
And let's go a little bit more general. Holly, what is happening at the moment? Well, how would you describe it?
You mean just the like batshittery of gender identity ideology?
Yeah.
You know, one thing I've been thinking about that I think is cool about what's happening, so I'm going to try to be like the positive guy, is that the young people have found a really interesting way to reconfigure group lines. So where it used to be like age or sex or ethnicity or religion or whatever, they've found it's a pseudo religion, right? But it's like a shared values gang. So it's like, it doesn't matter anymore if you're a man or a woman or brown or white or Muslim or whatever, so long as you subscribe to this set of values, right? And the values suck, I think. But the idea is kind of interesting that they've created this like queer, super inclusive on features of persons lines community. And you're allowed in just so long as you sign up to those values. That's sort of interesting, and it's sort of doing something that like older generations maybe haven't done as well. So I can sort of get on board with like respecting that project, or not. I don't know how intentional it is, but it looks like it's sort of what they're doing. That's kind of cool. But they're also like really going so far in the reality denying, science denying, computer influenced stuff. Like we're just used to being avatars online, so now we just think our whole material selves are just avatars that can be just fixed or changed or whatever. So I don't know. I'm sure there's a million complicated causes, but I think they're rebelling in a peculiar and interesting way. And it's just, I think that maybe the big objection about it is not so much what they're doing, but how selfish they're being about it relative to the older generations. That's the last thing I think I'd say on that, is like, even if you want to have a like gender doesn't matter anymore, like we're just a gang of cool people who are like post-sex humans. What about the 60-year-old woman whose boss sexually harassed her for 30 years, who's now forced to share the fucking bathroom with him? Like, so they've got no sense of how each generation above them has had to struggle with sex as an issue, like, and how men and women relate to each other. It's like they've just decided as 20-something-year-olds, we don't care about that stuff. We're post-sex differences. And then it's like, but we're going to enforce that on everyone now. So that gets my blood boiling, I think.
Yeah. The thing about it, of course, is that it ends up reinforcing the old power lines. Like Benji, GNC Centric, spoke to me about Morgan Page's trans support group. And she said that it's still one of the funniest and most amazing things, even though it's horrific. She said that the trans women would tell the younger trans men, the trans women were all in their 20s and 30s, the trans men if this is your first video here, trans men are young girls who think they're men. Yeah. But the trans men were told that they shouldn't speak so much because they had male privilege.
I love that. So stupid. Like it just instantly switches over.
Yeah. And it's also frightening because that's the same logic that that means that Girl Guiding in the UK suddenly decided that anyone who self-declares as a woman is automatically not subject to the same safeguarding controls that men are subject to.
Yeah,
It's
so worrying. And they have no evidence, right? There's no empirical evidence to suggest that trans women or having a gender identity makes you any exception at all to other men. No evidence, but it's just assumed. It's maddening. Yeah.
And it's like a belief in magic, kind of. It's like an odd belief in magic. And as we know, the worst thing about it is that, like Benji admits to it herself, she kind of sleptwalked into this situation that seemed to set up so these older trans women could start dating these younger trans men.
Yeah,
you know?
So that's creepy,
predatory.
It really is. It really is. So what's next for you, Holly? What are you up to over the coming months in fighting this stuff?
Well, I guess I'm an academic, so my specialty is just hiding my head inside the computer and trying to think this stuff through. So I don't know how helpful I really am to the movement, but I've got a book coming out on gender critical feminism. So I've been writing that. What is it? What's the movement? What's the theory? What's the relation to radical feminism? What issues should we care about? Who are we? So that's the first book. And then I've got another one that I'm just sort of finishing up, which is like a collection of gender critical essays that's more focused on the trans debate. So bathrooms, like what should bathroom policy be? And are there any good arguments for trans women are women? And is gender critical speech hate speech? Just questions like this. So that's been super fun to write, but most of those two projects are almost at an end. Don't know what's next. I think maybe prostitution, because I feel like I get called a TERF a lot, but not a SWERF as much. So we'll sort of balance things out.
Good. Okay. And Katherine, how about yourself? What's coming up for you?
So we're looking at the Save Women's Sports Australasia. So Pride in Sports has said that they're basically going to work through every single sports organisation in Australia and get them to incorporate the trans and gender diverse inclusion guidelines. And so that effectively means that any male can show up for registration and just tick the female box and compete. And that's at community and elite level. There are some sports that have a minor restriction, like Hannah Mountsie with AFL, but he is apparently going to be challenging that at tribunal. So we want to start lobbying the sports organisation. Well, we have started lobbying sports organisations and also politicians to get them to see what it means for women. I have also been told by a state bureaucrat that the only way we're going to succeed in having these guidelines repealed is if a woman is killed. So, yeah, that's what we've been told. So we don't want to get to that point where there's a young girl in a wheelchair or with an acquired brain injury or similar. So we're going to be looking at our options around that, because it just, I mean, in addition to that, there's also the safeguarding issue, because it says in all the guidelines that you can go into the toilets, change rooms, overnight accommodation of your choice. And if you are a parent, say of a girl, and there's a male coach or manager who's claiming that they're a female and they go on overnight accommodation and you raise an objection, it will be your daughter kicked off the team. That's how it works. So we're hoping that we might be able to put the brakes on that before it gets too far.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Well, best of luck with that. I mean, when someone points to numbers, if you bring up examples like, say, Karen White in the UK, who was sexually assaulted 4 women in prison after being put in a female prison, and people go, well, that's only 4 people. It's 4 people too many. It's 4 people too many. And one dead or injured woman is 1 dead or injured women too many, you know? Sorry, go on, Holly. You were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say one of the worst things here during the self-ID debate was that there was just an absolute refusal to commit to gathering any data. So they tried to get an amendment added in so that at least if we passed self-ID, we could be monitoring certain spaces where they were previously sex segregated. Now they're not. So what's happening in those spaces? Are women starting to self-exclude? Have there been more assaults? You know, we know that people underreport these things. So at least if we're kind of doing a monitoring project, we would have that data, but there's no data.
Yeah.
So it's like, we can't even now go back after 2 years and say, like, you did this thing, this is how much it actually harmed women. All we're going to see is the huge scandalous cases that actually make the headlines. And so I feel really just kind of hopeless about that, right? Because it's like, so many women are being harmed, and we don't know.
There's a real lack of imagination about this stuff. You know, there's a lack of kind of putting yourself into certain positions. Like, for instance, the idea that because the vast majority of women aren't complaining, they don't mind. But of course, as we all know, when you complain, your careers are ruined. Actually, that brings me on to something. Katherine, what did you say you're starting off in a legal career? What aspect again?
I'm in an area of law that's quite unrelated to that. So keep my advocacy and my my work life quite separate.
But do you not worry that, I mean, you know what they do? They will, you know, they find out your details and they write to your bosses and all that sort of thing. Does that not concern you?
I am transparent with what I do. So I don't know. I mean, it's a risk that I've weighed up, and I think that what I'm saying, well, you know, we have lawful protections, say, in relation to sport, where we are allowed to exclude on the basis of sex, and everything that I say, I can back up. So I don't feel that I'm saying anything hateful, and you know, I'll deal with it if and when it happens. But as I said, I've got 3 small children. You know, I have skin in the game on their behalf. And it was, you know, people just sort of weren't willing to speak up, and I just felt compelled to do so. I feel really strongly about this, and so I think for me personally, also, like, I've always loved 20th century history, and I think many people would say to themselves, oh, I'd never be the villagers that stayed quiet while they, you know, the trains went past or whatever. I would have been part of the French resistance, the underground, you know, I would have been one of those people. And when all of this was happening and no one was sort of speaking out, I thought, God, this is it. This is the moment in my life where I am going to have to stand up and say something against the status quo and against the establishment and say, I don't think this is right. And it might come at a cost to me, but I have to say it.
Good. Well, thank you. You know, without wanting to sound like an American and a veteran, thank you for your bravery, because there's not many, you know, who are willing to put their faces up. Holly, were you banned off Twitter? Were you one of my disappeared?
I was. Yeah. But I have more protection, right? So I think there's a sense of, it's a lot braver in Kath's position, especially going into a new career, right? Like, I'm, as an academic, I have protection, like the equivalent of tenure and the institutional support. So it's like, if someone in my position didn't speak up, what an asshole, right? Like, that is exactly the person who has to speak up if they see something. And then I think there's a lot more bravery. Yeah, people in Kath's position who are have children and have commitments and want a career and don't want to put up with being bullied and they still find a way to do it. I think that's amazing. Yeah,
me too. I think that there's I think that also you give courage to others. I'm speaking to James Dreyfus, an actor today who was cancelled 3 years ago because he signed a letter asking for a less toxic debate. And I could be wrong, but I think he is coming on because I interviewed Mr. Menno recently, a gay man.
So good.
Yeah. And I just think that every new face you see gives courage to the next person coming on. So thank you both so much for appearing. And if there's anything in future that you'd like me to amplify amplify. I don't even know if I amplify things, but hopefully. But
you do. Thank you.
Let me know. I mean, we can even pop on for little short ones, you know, if there's something you need to. So, yeah. All right. Well, Holly and Katherine, thank you so much for joining me. And I will see you again soon, I hope.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Graham.
Cool.